Hello and welcome to the first episode of Resilient State, a new podcast made and run by young people taking a fresh look at the UK's national security picture. Traditional security thinking expected threats to be visible, attributable and episodic, and something that could be deterred or defeated by armed capability alone. This podcast takes a different approach to national security, and that's a multi-domain approach. We do this because today power is more often exercised indirectly across systems that sustain everyday life. In this environment, security failures rarely begin with a military confrontation. A multi-domain failure could show up as higher energy bills, empty shelves, cyber outages, banking failures, just to name a few. You don't need to care about geopolitics to feel those effects. They're going to reach you anyway. Our new podcast doesn't seek to make security more complicated, but to make the discussion around security more honest. It reflects how threats actually work today, and why resiliency isn't just a military problem, but a whole of society one. Our aim is not just to explain these risks, but to explain how these risks affect you. I'm your host, Louise, and yes, that is my real name. I am a politics and international relations undergraduate here in London. I've written on Gen Z recruitment rates for the Aerospace magazine, and I've presented on the use of nuclear narratives and non-proliferation efforts for the Royal United Services Institute as part of their project on nuclear issues.
And I'm Luke Marchand. I'm a recovering graduate student of military history from SOAS, University of London. I specialize in insurgency and counterinsurgency, partner force building, the North Korean military, and Canadian national defense, among many other areas of interest. I'll be your co-host for this and several future episodes.
Now, for the first episode of Resilient State, we're going to be joined by two guest experts, each of whom will take us through the major international theatres of Europe and the Sahel. Each of these international theatres is hopefully going to serve two purposes. The first will be to illustrate how events taking place overseas can come back to affect us here in the UK, and how they can affect us here in the UK. The second aim is to explain that what creates a lack of security for a region can be multi-causal, and that a military solution alone is not going to provide you with the answers you need. We're not comparing these regions as places or ranking them against one another. We've deliberately chosen two very different security environments to illustrate how there are multiple causes and influences upon security and insecurity. Things like governance breakdown, economic pressures, and external interference. By choosing two theatres that operate in very different historical and political conditions, we think we're best able to illustrate this point and make the case for our podcast. So, with the introductions done, it's time to jump in and start the episode. Hi, it's Editing Louise here. Just a quick note to any listeners. You might notice the audio changes up at points throughout this episode. That's because it's stitched together from several separate interviews with our guests that took place over the winter holidays. Now, with that warning in place, we can jump back in. Our first guest this week is Dr. Louise Tumchewics. She's a visiting fellow in the Department of War Studies at King's College London and a research fellow at the Centre for War Studies at the University of Southern Denmark. She's advised numerous international organisations and financial institutions, and her work focuses on the intersection of technology, economics and geopolitics. Louise regularly speaks and writes about the global redistribution of power and what it means for Europe and the UK, with a particular interest in how strategic shocks translate into real-world risk and opportunity. Louise, it's wonderful to have you here with us today to talk about the European theatre, and I'd like to start with what might seem like an odd question, but what do we actually mean when we say Europe as a continent? It bleeds into other regions like Asia and the Middle East, and there's often confusion about which countries are considered European and where those boundaries lie. So before we even take a step into the security picture, where on the map are we talking about when we talk about Europe?
Well, I think that's actually an excellent question to start off with, because the word Europe is used as a shorthand. It can mean the European Union member states. It can also mean the European NATO allies, or it can mean all of the countries that make up the European continent, which, if we remember back to, I think it's year 6 geography, we get to color in the map that goes all the way to the Ural Mountains. Well, guess what? That's Europe. So I think, for the purpose of our conversation today, what I'll try to do is distinguish between the European continent when we're talking about that, the European Union when we're talking about that particular political and economic organization, and then the European allies within NATO when we're talking about those states as well.
I think that'll be very helpful because I know it's said as a sort of catch-all term with the speaker understanding what they mean, but then, as you said, it can have different meanings and different associations. So, building from that, I was wondering if you could start explaining the security situation of Europe to us, and again, I'll say Europe, but you can specify as to which Europe you're referring to in your answer. But if you had to sum up Europe's security situation as it stands in late 2025, how would you describe it, and what are the major undercurrents that you'd say are shaping that picture? We, of course, have Russian aggression and the land war in Ukraine to the east, but I also know that there are migration trends and economic trends and political polarisation and these internal undercurrents that are shaping our Europe security picture. So I was wondering if you could just discuss that to start with before we dive into specifics.
Absolutely. So I would say that the word I would pick to sum up Europe's security situation for late 2025, I would say it is challenging. So we have a land war on the European continent, as you have mentioned, and we have an aggressive and belligerent Russia that is intent on using hybrid mechanisms to interfere and destabilize particularly Western European countries, but we also saw their active interference into the Moldovan elections towards the end of 2025. We also have other, quite significant economic and demographic challenges facing Europe as well. So low productivity, low economic growth, and then demographics, an aging population, a declining birth rate, and then the challenges of migration. However, I would not go so far as to say that Europe is facing civilizational erasure. I would say that the US national security strategy released earlier this month is probably exaggerating that a bit. Don't think Europe is in danger of being erased, but it certainly faces many, many challenges, not least its strategic relationship with the US. And that is particularly European NATO allies' strategic relationship with the US, the European Union's relationship with the US, particularly in regards to trade and tariffs, and then continued American support for Ukraine.
So I think there's a general agreement that Europe's security situation is, as you said, challenging. And as you've mentioned, there's this very broad array of reasons as to why that is. But do you think that perhaps there is a hyper-focus on technical fixes? There's currently the talk of the Great Drone Wall across Eastern Europe, which is going to be an integrated multinational defence system. So it'll be a series of incorporated drone defences, which essentially covers the eastern flank of Europe to defend against any Russian incursions and to act as a deterrent power. I think back to a few weeks ago, we saw the events in France where there was a kick-off, to put it bluntly. I believe it was the French Army Chief of Staff, a guy named General Fabien Madon. Forewarning, my pronunciation there might not be perfect, but he was talking to a congress of French mayors, and there was an outcry when General Madon warned of the French spirit, that it lacked the preparedness or the willingness to accept that France and the French people might have to suffer and lose their children in war. And so that suggests to me that there's a deeper reluctance to face and talk frankly about the personal and societal risk that war brings. So do you think that policymakers are perhaps solving the easy problems, these technical problems, and neglecting these harder discussions about risk and loss and suffering, which could actually itself then be driving risk because it might be exacerbating recruitment crises or a lack of general public awareness of the threat level, because we are unwilling to have those harder discussions and we are more willing to talk on easy solutions, and that's these technical solutions?
So what I think is with threats, visible threats to European security, the kind of drone incursions in Poland, in Denmark, and elsewhere this autumn, and the rapid response to, build a great drone wall across Europe, it is reaching for that technological situation. And there's been lots of emphasis on increased military spending and investment in military hardware. But I think what's missing is, well, we can talk about technologies, we can count the number of tanks, we can quantify the billions of euros that are being directed into military spending. It's much harder for European policymakers to clearly articulate between military capabilities and what those strategic objectives they want to achieve with those military capabilities. So the expansion in military hardware has outpaced most European states' capacity to clearly articulate what their strategic objectives are, but also what role would their citizens be taking in achieving those strategic objectives. And furthermore, the European Union as a geopolitical actor remains quite ambiguously defined. What role is it going to take in continental security? Whilst member states are very keen to, demonstrate their investment in military capabilities, the European Union is having difficulty with articulating a clear strategic intention and indeed a role for itself in defense and security. The danger of that is having accelerating rearmament without a cohesive political message and clear strategic objectives can become quite destabilizing.
Do you think we're looking at a genuine new normal for European security, that we are going to be seeing this increased level of sustained threat perception and higher defence spending? Or do you think this is a temporary spike that could fade? If there is a change in the US administration that reaffirms a commitment to Europe, do you think Europe will tone down its new defence spending and reshaping defence? Or do you think it's one where actually now what has happened to trigger this rearmament spending, to trigger this focusing on defence, is permanent, that the change has been made and it now cannot go back? And if you don't mind me following up on that, what indicators would you watch to tell the difference? So if you're somebody who is watching European politics, watching this rapid ramp up of defence spending, what are the indicators that you look for to see if it's going to be a sustained effort or if it's a temporary spiking effort?
This represents a new normal. So regardless of the next administration, I think we have to acknowledge that US hegemonic power has diminished. And even long before Donald Trump, and actually going as far back as the Eisenhower administration, there's been a desire on the part of US presidents for Europeans to shoulder a larger share of the responsibility for European security. Talking about Europeans in this context is, of course, European NATO allies. So I think spending more on defense will be a reality, particularly as the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, they may reach a ceasefire agreement. They may reach some form of peace in inverted commas agreement, but there is going to be considerable instability and concern about the shape of that conflict going forwards. I don't think that this will end neatly and nicely with peace breaking out all over and a happy return to the Europe of the 1990s. In terms of indicators to watch to tell the difference between, we're making lots of noise about increased defense investment versus the reality for the long term, it's probably not going to be the kind of stuff that makes headlines or makes for good sound bites. Things like, saying we're going to spend $800 billion on defense is a great soundbite, but it is looking through various budget documents and seeing what money is actually allocated, what money actually gets spent, and where.
Now that we've set out the landscape and why it matters, I think it'll be interesting to examine European security almost in isolation, and then at the end we can circle back and say, what does this mean for the UK? So I think Luke's going to jump in now and talk about Russia, deterrence, and escalation risks. Or at least that's what my scripting says he's going to talk about.
Yeah, I suppose the big one to start with is everyone is talking about it more openly now. Russia as a durable threat to European security, no longer just maybe viewed as a competitor or kind of a nebulous actor that we discuss obliquely in policy documents. It's now being openly stated that Russia is the primary threat to European security. So how does that shape the European security environment in maybe ways beyond the obvious headlines of threats of nuclear war or the prospect of major fighting in the Baltics. How is that shaping the security environment in Europe generally?
Of course, we have Russia's continued war in Ukraine, which very much continues to shape Europe's security environment. And having an active, open conflict on the European continent obviously has lots of political and economic effects for Europe. Europe continues to support Ukraine, and the European Union has just committed 105 billion euros to assisting Ukraine without dipping into Russian frozen assets, mind you. So that war continues to shape the European security environment and also the European security consciousness, where states are looking at how Russia is fighting in Ukraine and making decisions about military capabilities based on what they're seeing in the Ukrainian theater. We're also seeing Russian hybrid threats, and whether that's drone attacks, supply chain sabotage, cyber attacks, election interference, as we saw in Moldova. I think this is something that, regardless of the resolution of the war in Ukraine, that this would be something that we would continue to see emanating from Russia. It happened before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and I think it would be the kind of aggressive activity that Russia, under its present regime, would be inclined to continue. And of course, we're looking at the map of Europe. European NATO allies, particularly those in the East, will be feeling particularly vulnerable. And that certainly shapes our perception of what activity Russia could take next. The second order effects for UK national security, I think, will be a shift away from concentrating elsewhere in the world or extending global presence to really focus much more on what is happening in Europe and in the UK supporting its European NATO allies, rather than trying to have a presence in the Indo-Pacific, for example, or trying to have a presence in the Middle East, contributing to stabilization missions or things like that. I think a lot more of that attention is going to be focused on Europe and on Eastern Europe. The UK also needs to consider how it strengthens its defenses against Russian hybrid threats, particularly in cyberspace, and particularly things like supply chain security and border security.
So I'm actually going to go a little bit out of order here with the question, because I think this segues a bit better. What are the most plausible escalation pathways below the threshold of open war? You've mentioned, of course, and we've all seen the various Russian campaigns of sabotage, some of which have been pretty daring. I think we all wonder what might have happened if, for instance, the attempted bombing of those cargo airliners had actually come off. So when you look at potential escalation pathways below Russian tanks trying to reach the suburbs of Tallinn, where do you see the likely threats coming from?
Sorry, can I just jump in here ahead of you, Louise? Luke, just a quick one for anybody listening. Could you very briefly run through Russian sabotage and bombing of cargo planes, just so people know what we're talking about?
Right. I don't have the full articles in front of me, but there was a Russian plot which was disrupted, I believe late last year, to plant bombs on a number of cargo planes. These were concealed within the kind of ordinary packages that get shipped by air freight all over Europe. And the jig was up when many of these detonated prematurely in their depots. But had they been rigged or fused correctly, some experts at least believe that they would have detonated in flight aboard these planes with, of course, substantial disruption to the cargo freight that is pretty load-bearing for European and global supply chains. I think we can all see how that might have been a substantial step up, even from Russian drone activity over certain European airports recently that grounded flights, or various other acts of sabotage for hire that the Russians have been undertaking in various countries, generally engaging criminal actors through Telegram. So that's what I'm referencing with this question, of course. When we talk about escalation pathways, I find it hard to believe that even Moscow could really predict how European countries might react to something of that magnitude. So when we think about escalation beyond a sudden conventional military bolt from the blue, what pathways are you looking out for?
So similar to you, I probably wouldn't speculate on how various European states would respond to an escalation or a perceived escalation. But what I would look at is plausible escalation pathways. I think when we're talking about hybrid war, Russia is going to look for, those soft targets. They're going to look for existing vulnerabilities. Driving a tank into Talon is pretty, it's going to provoke quite a predictable response. So maybe it wouldn't do that. But they look at, say, European supply chains are really vulnerable due to open borders and the free movement of goods across Europe. There aren't as many security checks as there should be on cargo. The amount of e-commerce, just the sheer volume of packages that crisscross Europe on a daily basis makes it quite difficult for cargo to move efficiently and also securely. Another big vulnerability is the cyber domain. European states, with a few notable exceptions, are highly digitized. European populations rely very much on digital banking, digital communication. When is the last time that any of the three of us are going and paying for things in cash? Probably hasn't happened all that recently. Destabilizing or interfering with banking systems. But also looking at other parts of the European continent, not necessarily European NATO countries or European Union countries, but areas like Transnistria or Moldova or even Georgia, and seeing how they can foment dissent, perhaps install or promote a pro-Russian regime.
I guess naturally coming on the heels of that is the question of deterrence. Obviously, the safest way to avoid any of this being tested is to deter these activities before they begin. So where on the part of Europe is deterring Russia working well, and where is it brittle? And that's across all domains, from the military one to political cohesion, industrial capacity, public resilience. Where is Europe scoring well, and where does it have a lot of room to improve?
Across the board, Europe has a lot of room to improve. I think, number one, probably military capability. We've got a big gap between what European militaries need to be capable of doing and what they're currently capable of doing and sustaining, more importantly, as well as political cohesion. What I was saying earlier about having a clear strategic objective and being able to clearly articulate that to a population, and having the social cohesion to know that those kinds of strategic objectives are understood and supported by European populations. I think despite nearly 4 years of a war on the European continent, a lot of day-to-day life for many Europeans probably hasn't changed that much. So are we really deterring Russia, or do we just have some inherent vulnerabilities that we haven't really been willing to address? So I would say across the board, Europe has a lot of room to improve. Number one, military capability. We've got a big gap between what European militaries need to be capable of doing and what they're currently capable of doing and sustaining, more importantly. What I was saying earlier about having a clear strategic objective and being able to clearly articulate that to a population, and having the social cohesion to know that those kinds of strategic objectives are understood and supported by European populations. And really, I think despite nearly 4 years of a war on the European continent, a lot of day-to-day life for many Europeans probably hasn't changed that much. So are we really deterring Russia, or do we just have some inherent vulnerabilities that we haven't really been willing to address?
That's a very good question, a very loaded question, but I've got my own answers. I'm sure most listeners will too. I think lastly, this might be the most expansive question for this section. How do we think that the risk environment changes between the current phase of open conflict in Ukraine and any kind of hypothetical post-war phase, when perhaps that immediate threat of conflict in Ukraine to focus the mind has been taken away? Do we start to see maybe drift in Europe's cohesive approach? And do we start to see maybe a difference of opinion in how quickly or if Europe should re-engage with Russia at all? In other words, what kind of hidden risks would any kind of settlement to the war in Ukraine pose to a long-term European shift to bolster its security? Obviously, that's a very big question, but if you could take a stab at it, I'd appreciate it.
All right. Well, I think, as you say, questions of a potential resolution to the war in Ukraine and the Trump administration's various peace plan options, we could do a whole other podcast episode just on that, maybe several. But coming back to your question, I think we have to distinguish between the current period and then any hypothetical post-war phase. So we have to acknowledge that despite multiple sanctions packages, are we at round 19 now? Russia is not fully cut off from Europe. Europe still imports a number of commodities from Russia, although most of these will be phased out by 2028. However, that's still another 2 years away. And we do see fracturing within Europe over the perception of the Russian threat. So Eastern European states that border Russia typically perceive Russia as an existential threat that necessitates maximum deterrence, where the further west we go, we see that states maintain perhaps a more cautious and even ambivalent approach. Then in Italy and Slovakia, there's been some voicing of growing public fatigue with the current security situation in Europe. And we have Hungary that openly defies European sanctions. So we already see fracturing within Europe regarding that relationship with Russia. Post-war, what constitutes an acceptable relationship with Russia will depend a lot on what shape a ceasefire agreement or peace agreement takes. So, for instance, if the war in Ukraine ends up with a ceasefire and some sort of frozen conflict, reminiscent of the situation in the Donbass from 2014 to 2022, probably sanctions on Russia might not relax, and Russia would still be treated as a pariah by certain European countries, while others might be more open to cooperation and commodities trade. If it was another type of peace agreement, or even one that eventually led, perhaps, to a regime change in Russia, I think we would see the relationship with Russia taking a very different course.
All right. Thank you very much. Get a reprieve. I'll hand it back to Sophie for another line of tuning you.
I mean, it's just one question, actually, and then I'm going to throw it right back to Luke. But I thought I would jump in because we've just had a few questions looking at Russia and the Russian threat. As you said, there's an active land war, so it takes precedent. But I was wondering, are we missing the forest for the trees? I mean, we've seen moves by China to build closer ties with several European nations. They've been very lovey-dovey in some of their communiques and their language towards European nations. And also, might America start pursuing bilateral relations with specific European countries that create further fracturing? Are we missing other threats to European security because we are also focused on the threat of Russia?
Yes, absolutely. Russia is the primary focus and perceived as the primary security threat to Europe. However, because Russia is identified as the primary security threat, doesn't mean that China is Europe's best friend. Remember that China and Russia have their so-called no limits partnership, and that China is supplying drones to both sides of this conflict. Both Russia and Ukraine are highly dependent on Chinese drones and drone component parts in the war. And even if China is attempting to build a relationship and issuing lots of warm, friendly language, that China's understanding of that relationship will be very different to a European understanding of that relationship. Similarly, Europe's relationship with the United States will also be one where this puts Europe in a very awkward position between two of the world's two largest economies that Europe still needs to trade with, but has to be cautious in its relationship with both of them and avoid trading dependencies that it has on the US or creating new dependencies on China. So that is a very difficult position to be squeezed in the middle. It's very hard to be the filling of the sandwich. But I think there are also risks that Europe has to be alive to. Again, we're using Europe as sort of an umbrella term, but there are many versions of Europe, as we mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, and different ambitions for Europe, as we see with the rise of far-right movements which are now openly supported by the US, as mentioned in the national security strategy, that have a very different view of Europe. And the risk of fragmentation, particularly fragmentation created by attempting to respond to the Russian threat.
What does European security actually mean in practice then for day-to-day UK national security? So what do we actually want in terms of security in Europe? Do we want to have, say, secure supply chains moving with minimal restriction? And could we then let the social cohesion within Europe collapse? Or would, for the UK national security picture, would it be willing to allow some of the supply lines and logistics of Europe to collapse, and if it kept social cohesion? So what actually are we talking about when European security? What are the bits that really affect the UK?
The UK cannot see itself as separate from European security. Things that impact Europe will naturally impact the UK. Yes, the UK is an island, the northwest corner of Europe, but there's still so much interaction and dependencies between the UK and Europe that what happens on the continent affects what happens in the UK. Would say it's very difficult to make a choice between, say, supply chains and logistics and social cohesion because the two things are so interconnected, particularly in our modern world where in our lives we have such efficient systems that most of us don't have the kind of redundant supplies. This will probably be quite reminiscent of COVID, that most of us, have moved on from having 6 months supply of toilet paper at home or, a year's worth of tinned tomatoes. So we rely on there being choice and supplies in the shops. And we saw, it was really only 5 years ago, and we saw how quickly social cohesion can break down when consumer goods are not dependably available. Maintaining security and stability of supply is really essential to social cohesion. So if things were to go awry on the continent, that would be of concern to the UK and probably impacting the UK as well.
I was 10 years old when the Brexit debate happened, so my interest in politics kind of grew at a time as we were seeing the acceleration and increasingly loud debate about nationalist strategy. We saw that in the Brexit referendum here in the UK, you see it with the rise of Trump and the America First agenda. How can government, so the UK government or actually the national government of any European nation state or state in whatever iteration of Europe we use, how can a government make a credible case for long-term European defence cooperation whilst there is this domestic current too? Do you think, say, the shared wartime history of Europe, going through World War and World War II, might that help? Could that be utilised more? Or is there another way that you can make the case for this very collective security?
I think we have to go back and look at what are the drivers for the nationalist movement, typically on the right end of the political spectrum. We've seen this throughout Europe. I mean, Britain has probably been the most vocal, but, this was certainly something that has been we've seen it in France, we've seen it in the Netherlands, we see it in Germany and elsewhere across the continent, that there is this skepticism with membership in the European Union, with greater desire for a renationalization. But what are the drivers of that? Are they economic drivers? Are they social drivers? And thinking particularly in the case of Brexit, is it a lack of understanding about how the European Union works and what its interaction is with the UK, for example, as a nation state? Because I also see many of these movements taking root. I'm thinking in particular AfD in Germany, taking root in the east of the country, which has had lower economic performance, is facing a lot of challenges, and of course not part of West Germany for many decades and only rejoined Germany after the fall of the Berlin Wall and has been playing both social and economic catch-up since then. I think we really have to look at the drivers of these nationalist movements and finding effective counter to them. Now, security might not be the most effective counter argument to that, but trying to understand those movements. And I think part of the challenge is many of those things have particular emotional quality to them, and they're typically fear-based. And how do we, as we saw in the Brexit debate, that meeting fear-based emotion with rational facts doesn't always win over your opposing side. So finding an effective way to recapture those populations that are attracted to these nationalist movements.
Thank you. I'll jump in to round off. We've had a very broad discussion today looking at what Europe is and the crisis is facing it. And for every interview on this podcast, we try and end it off with somewhat of a positive note. So for other people like me and Luke, for young people who, any of the listeners to this episode today, a lot of the obvious routes into the European theatre have narrowed. So you saw the Brexit decision and the pull away from Europe. So listeners based in the UK trying to get in, say, the European Parliament, that access isn't there anymore. So going in and helping and working within those organisations, working on matters related to security have gone. So I was wondering if you could say what pathways still exist, perhaps through NATO or through other big organisations at play in Europe, which really are working to tackle issues around security and to ensure the continued stability of Europe. What's there for people to actually say, well, I care about this, and if they wanted to go and have a look at what's taking place and the projects taking place, and if they actually could contribute to them and if they have the expertise for them, what's there? Because I think so many of those traditional routes that we would have taken through our European Union membership aren't there anymore.
We're seeing a shift. We're seeing a fundamental change in both in world order and in security eras. So for people entering the workforce now, or you're leaving university or other forms of study and saying, gosh, I'd like to be involved in defense and security, you'll be moving into a growth area. This will be something that expands, where there will be increased defense spending, more attention paid to defense and security compared to the last 35 or 40 years. I think there will be many different ways for people to pursue careers in defense and security that are not limited to European Union organizations. Of course, there are internships through NATO. Those are quite limited, they're quite competitive, but there will also be a huge expansion, I think, in the commercial sector in hiring, whether that is for a big defense prime or for smaller defense companies. There's also going to be much more emphasis on geopolitical awareness. Defense and security investing that will be in different parts of the commercial sector, whether that's banking or consulting. I think there's going to be abundant opportunities. I would say that it's important to focus on skill development as much as job title or organization. So what role is going to give me an opportunity to develop skills that I can then take with me to another organization? So for instance, if say you applied on a NATO internship and you didn't get it, that doesn't mean that the world of defense and security would be closed to you, but it would be looking at, okay, where can I get experience writing policy or preparing presentations or being exposed to defense procurement and seeing where else, whether that might be the UK government, it might be with commercial entities as well, and trying to collect as many skills as you can. But I would say it is a growth industry. I think it would be far more challenging if you were looking to get into sort of the peace end of things. But I think, yes, it will be something where there will be hiring opportunities for graduates, but it's also an industry that won't be closed to you, even if that isn't your first job. And we'll be thinking, okay, what kind of skills do I need that are attractive in this particular industry, in the defense industry or in the defense and security space?
I think my last question for the episode would be just For any listeners who are really interested in European security, what would you say are the publications that you look to which actually you think are really good at reporting on what's happening in Europe and within Europe, and not just the big headline states of Germany and France, but across all of Europe and actually a broad range of areas? Because I think I often have a look at, say, the BBC, but for something to make the international news headlines, usually it loses some of the detail that perhaps people might want, which actually really helps explain the picture on the ground. So where do you go to find out what's actually happening within Europe and on the ground?
Oh, wow. That is a big question. And perhaps I'll send some suggestions that you can attach in the show notes.
Absolutely. We'll link anything you send into the episode description. So everything you send will be able to link in.
So it depends, of course, what a reader is after. I think for longer form, typically more in-depth articles tend to have a transatlantic focus, but foreign affairs is always a good bet for understanding some larger picture background. Then things like Geopolitical Monitor, if you are very focused on the war in Ukraine specifically, the Institute for the Study of War. On the more academic end, you have things like The Conversation or War on the Rocks. We're so fortunate right now that we actually have just an abundance of outlets, and it's possible to get too much information rather than too little. But with any source, I would really encourage listeners and prospective readers to try to learn as much as they can about that source, its editorial bias, who the contributors are, what its objectives are, and really importantly, what its fact-checking process is. We have an abundance of information out there, but we are also living in an era of disinformation and misinformation. So looking at our sources with a critical eye is really important.
Okay, I think that's a good place to end. We've gone through all the questions we have in the time allowed, and I think you've definitely helped broaden our understanding of Europe, not just the threats that the continent is facing, but what's happening within it and what the future holds. I think what this conversation has really showed is that European security can't rely alone on heavy investing in military capabilities, which is a bit of a problem, seeing as Europe is currently investing very heavily in military capabilities, and in military capabilities alone, it sometimes feels. But I think talking to you has really made this point that if goods don't reach shelves, if energy prices spike, or if trust in institutions start to erode, then security on the European continent is already failing. As you've made clear, the UK can't see itself as separate from Europe in this. We're too interconnected. So what happens on the continent won't stay on the continent. And that's exactly why, we're taking this multi-domain approach in this podcast. Because today's security is about how your society functions under pressure, not just what happens on the battlefield. But Louise, thank you very much for joining us. I mean, it's been incredibly valuable to have you help set out the landscape for Europe for this episode and really explain European security for us.